In this unit, Unit 2, we're going to talk about some additional features in Active Directory, or really, I don't want to say features, but really things that you really need to know about Active Directory that are important to know. So we're going to talk about in this first slide deck, you'll find two slide decks for this unit. In the first one, we're going to talk about organizational units, user accounts, groups, computers, and then how to automate some of this account management. Once we understand how accounts are configured and grouped and all that stuff and some of the administrative things, then we're going to talk about group policy. And group policy, that although the name doesn't really imply it, but group policy is all about enforcing policies, IT security policies for the most part. So restrictions and things like that. So we'll talk about that in the second slide deck. So let's get started talking about organizational units. So basically, an organizational units is part of the hierarchical structure of Active Directory. Basically, an organizational unit is the highest level of hierarchy. And here's a depiction of what that hierarchy might look like. So, for example, in a large organization, you might have a department for administration, a different department for research and development, and then operations, manufacturing, and so forth. And even some departments could have organizational units even within those different units. Larger organizations can have many, many different organizational units. For example, a government entity like a county government might have the Department of Sanitation, they might have the Department of Health, and then the judiciary, the prisons, and the sheriff, and all these other different departments that might be in a large county government. They're all one big organization, but you have very different needs and requirements in all these different organizational areas. The other thing about organizational units is not only thinking back to that example with a large county government, for example, even though it's all one huge domain, you don't have just one administrator for that entire domain. You might have the health department's going to have their own IT administration, and they're going to want to have their own control within their own department. The finance department or the taxation division of taxation or whatever you want to call it, they might have their own IT administrators that need to have their own control of their organizational units. So OUs give you the ability to delegate administration of Active Directory within their own organizational units. So while you can have that overarching Active Directory structure, you can delegate control to these different organizational units to individuals within those organizational units. And I've even seen organizations that are large enough that you sort of have these Active Directory administrators within an OU that really work kind of autonomously from the larger Active Directory structure. They may not ever talk to people who are administrators in other OUs. For example, the Division of Taxation may never talk to people who work in the Department of Health. For example, they may very rarely interact with each other, but they're all in the same domain. So you get kind of a sense of how large an organization might be, and it would really need to take advantage of this concept of OU, of having OUs and being able to delegate control of those OUs. So Active Directory object permissions, as far as OUs are concerned, there are three types of security principles that can be assigned permissions to an object. You have users, groups, and computers, which I'm going to talk about in this unit. And an object's security settings are composed of three components: discretionary access control lists, which I'll call DACL for short, and then the object owner, and then system access control list. So discretionary access control list is, as the name implies, discretionary is when a user has the capability of assigning permission to their object, and then you have an object owner, which implicitly has control of an object, and then you can have system access control list, or I'll call it SACL for short. So DACL and SACL. So object permissions, continuing, every object has these permissions. You have read, write, full control, and then create child objects or delete child objects. But the main ones here are read, write, and full control, and you'll see those in the dialog boxes when you're working with objects in Active Directory. So why are we talking about this now? So in Active Directory, there's this concept of inheritance. So permissions can be inherited from objects. In other words, if an object has a parent, then it can inherit permissions from that parent. So when you set permissions for an object, what's important to remember is when you set permissions on an object, those permissions may permeate to objects below that object in the hierarchical structure. So its children will inherit the permissions that are set on the parents. So again, it's important to understand that structure when you're working with OUs or when you're working with objects within OUs. So the default settings in Active Directory, users and computers hide some of the folders for OUs, which you can enable, and these are the folders that you'll see. We'll talk about some of these later on in the course, such as Lost and Found Program, Data System, NTDS quotas, and the Trusted Platform Module devices. So again, we'll talk about those later on, but just understand this is where you would enable those. So in the property dialog box of the domain folder and OU objects, you will have 3 tabs: the Object, Security, and Attribute Editor tabs. So effective permissions is the permissions of an object, which are a combination of all the allowed and denied permissions assigned to a security principal, and that includes all of the permissions that are inherited. So the effective permissions are all of the allowed and denied permissions as well as inherited permissions from within that hierarchical structure. And one of the things that's important to remember about effective permissions is it's not always obvious what the permissions are in an object. When you look at an object's properties, sometimes you have to understand the inheritance as well. So this object only is a permission setting that isn't inherited by child objects. And then this object and all descendant objects is a permission setting that's going to apply to all of the children of that object. And then all descendant is when you're applying a permission not to the object itself, but to only its children. So you might have an object that has permissions that are not applied to it, but rather only to the children of that object. And then descendant objects, which is where the permission is inherited only by specific child object types, such as a user, computer, or a group object. So you can get pretty granular with how these permissions are assigned. With that granularity comes a lot of control, but also a lot of confusion if you get too granular with this. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit when we talk about groups later on. So effective permissions. So several permissions are added to an OU's discretionary access control list by default when it is created. So to view which permissions are inherited and which have been added to a DACL by viewing the Advanced Security Settings dialog box. So you can see those when you look in the Advanced Settings dialog box. Permission inheritance is enabled by default on child objects, but it can be disabled. So you can disable the inheritance of permissions if you like, but use caution before changing permissions and permission inheritance, because if you turn off permission inheritance, the permissions that would have been inherited are no longer applied. So that may cause confusion, and it also may cause a lapse in security policy. All right, in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about user accounts.